In this chapter, we will discuss sampling for tests of controls and substantive tests of transactions. At the end of chapter 15, you should be able to do the following. You should be able to explain the concept of representative sampling, distinguish between statistical and non-statistical sampling, between probability sampling and non-probability sampling. You should also be able to select samples using probability and non-probability methods, define and describe audit sampling for exception rates, use non-statistical sampling in the test of controls and substantive tests of transactions, define and describe attribute sampling and a sampling distribution, and lastly, be able to use attribute sampling in the test of controls and substantive tests of transactions. We will begin chapter 15 by discussing the concept of representative sampling. A representative sample is one in which the characteristics in the sample are approximately the same as those of the population. Auditors strive to get a representative sample for testing. Auditors never know if a sample is representative or not, but the auditor can increase the likelihood by using care in designing the sampling process, the sample selection, and the evaluation of sample results. A sample, even a representative sample, has the risk of two types of errors, which are the sampling error and the non-sampling error. The risks of these two types of errors are called sampling risk and non-sampling risk. By definition, sampling risk is the risk that an auditor reaches an incorrect conclusion because the sample is not representative of the entire population of the audit. Sampling risk can be controlled by the auditor by adjusting the sampling size and using an appropriate method of selecting sample items from the population. In contrast, a non-sampling risk is the risk that the auditor reaches an incorrect conclusion for any reason not related to sampling risk. Common reasons are the auditor's failure to recognize exceptions and the auditor's use of ineffective audit procedures. Our next discussion will cover the distinction between statistical and non-statistical sampling and the distinction between probability sampling versus non-probability sampling. Keep in mind that statistical and non-statistical sampling methods both involve the same three phases when used in audit. The three phases are planning the sample, selecting the sample and performing the test, as well as evaluating the results. Statistical sampling applies mathematical rules so that the auditor can quantify sampling risk in planning the sample, which is step 1, and evaluating results, which is the step 3 of the three phases when used in audits. In contrast, non-statistical sampling does not quantify sampling risk, but a properly designed non-statistical sample can provide effective results in audits. In probability sampling, the auditor randomly selects items such that each item has a known probability of being included in the sample. When statistical sampling is used, a probability sample must be used. In contrast, non-probability sampling selection is any other method of selecting a sample. We will further discuss selecting samples using probability and non-probability sampling method. The methods used in probability sampling selection includes simple random sample selection, systematic sample selection, and probability proportional to size sample selection. In contrast, non-probability sample selection method includes the haphazard sample selection and the black sample selection method. Using simple random sample selection method under the probability sample selection, the auditor uses every possible combination of population items that has an equal chance of being included in the sample. This requires a method to make sure that all items in the population have an equal chance of selection. Auditors often generate random numbers by using one of three computer sample selection techniques, such as the use of an electronic spreadsheet, a random number generator, or a generalized audit software. In here, we have an example that shows the random selection of sales invoices for the audit of Hillsburg Hardware Company using an electronic spreadsheet program to select the sampling. In this example, the auditor requires 50 sample items from a population of sales invoice numbered from 3,689 to 9,452. The program requires only input parameters to create a sample for the auditor to select. Such programs are able to generate random dates or ranges of sets of numbers and provide output in either a sorted or selection order in which the auditor can use. You can find Figure 15-1 on page 486 of your textbook. For systematic sample selection, in this method, the auditor calculates an interval and then selects items for the sample based on the size of the interval. The interval is determined by dividing the population by the desired sample size. In many auditing situations, it is advantageous to select samples that emphasize population items with larger recorded amounts, such as when applying probability proportional to size and stratified sample selection method. Haphazard sample selection is a method of selecting samples by selecting items without any conscious bias by the auditor, and the shortcoming is the difficulty of remaining completely unbiased on the part of the auditor when using this type of sampling selection. Black sample selection is a method where the auditor selects the first item in a black and then the remainder of the black is chosen in sequence. It is acceptable to use black sampling if a reasonable number of blacks is used. Although these methods seem less logical than the probability sampling method, there are auditing situations in which a probability method is not practical, such as in the situation of auditing a population that is not numbered in any way. Our next discussion will cover the definition and the description of audit sampling for exception rates. When testing controls and performing substantive tests of transactions, the auditor determines whether the controls are operating effectively and whether the rate of monetary errors is below tolerable limits. To test this, auditors estimate the percent of items in a population containing a characteristic or attribute of interest. This percentage is called the occurrence rate or exception rate. Auditors are interested in the following types of exceptions in accounting data, which are the deviations from the client's established controls, monetary misstatements in populations of transaction data, and monetary misstatements in populations of account balance details. When testing controls and performing substantive tests of transactions, the auditor focuses on the upper limit of the estimated population exception rate, which is the computed upper exception rate, or CUER. We will cover next discussions on non-statistical sampling in tests of controls and substantive tests of transactions. As previously mentioned, the three phases of sampling are identical for both statistical and non-statistical sampling. These three phases are to plan the sample, select the sample and perform the audit procedures, and lastly, to evaluate the results. There are 14 well-defined steps that fall under the three phases of sampling. Table 15-1, as shown here, provides us the terms used in audit sampling, specifically terms related to the three phases of sampling for both statistical and non-statistical sampling. The three phases being planning the sample, selecting the sample, and performing the audit procedures, as well as evaluating the results. Terms related to planning include characteristic or attribute, tolerable exception rate, estimated population exception rate, and initial sample size. Terms related to the third phase of sampling, which is evaluating the results, include exception, sample exception rate, and the computed upper exception rate. As we go through the discussion on this chapter, you will find that we will encounter some of these terms during the discussions. You can find Table 15-1 on page 489 of your textbook. I do recommend that you read the definition for each term, so as you go through the discussion and through your textbook, the terms will become a little more familiar and identifiable to you. As previously mentioned, there are three phases when sampling for tests of controls and substantive tests of transactions. These three phases involve 14 well-defined steps. The first phase, which is phase 1, involves planning the sample. The steps in planning the sample includes stating the objectives of the audit test, deciding whether audit sampling applies, defining the attributes and exception conditions, defining the population, defining the sampling unit, specifying the tolerable exception rate, specifying acceptable risk of over-reliance, estimating the population deviation or exception rate, and determining the initial sample size to be used for the audit. The second phase, which is phase 2, involves selecting the sample and performing the audit procedures. The steps in phase 2 include selecting the sample and performing the audit procedures. The last phase, when sampling for tests of controls and substantive tests of transactions, is Phase 3, which involves evaluating the results of the sampling. The steps in Phase 3 include generalizing from the sample to the population, analyzing exceptions, and lastly, deciding the acceptability of the population. In here, we will expand on the discussion on the different steps involved in the 3 phases of audit sampling. As previously mentioned, in Phase 1, planning the sample, the first step is to state the objectives of the audit test. The objectives of the test must be in terms of the transaction cycle being tested. The objectives are usually defined as testing the operating effectiveness of controls within the entity and determining whether the transactions contain monetary misstatements. The second step of Phase 1 is deciding whether audit sampling applies. Audit sampling applies whenever the auditor plans to reach conclusions about a population based on a sample selected. In here, we have Table 15-2 as an example that illustrates the audit procedures for the sales cycle for Hillsburg Hardware Company, where audit sampling was determined to be appropriate. You can find Table 15-2 on page 491 of your textbook. The third step in Phase 1 is defining the attributes and exception conditions. The auditors must carefully define the characteristics or attributes being tested, as well as the exception conditions. The fourth step in Phase 1 is defining the population. These are items which the auditor wishes to generalize. The auditor defines the population consistent with the objectives of the test. The fifth step of Phase 1 is defining the sampling unit. The sampling unit is defined based on the population and the sample selection method. And here we have an example of the 9 attributes of interest and exception conditions taken from Audit Procedures 12 through 14 in the Audit of Hillsburg Company's billing function. The samples of sales invoices will be used to verify these attributes. Do keep in mind that the absence of the attribute for any sample item will be an exception for that attribute. Both missing documents and immaterial misstatements will result in exceptions unless the auditor specifically states otherwise in the exception conditions. You can find Table 15-3 on page 492 of your textbook. The sixth step for Phase 1 is to specify the tolerable exception rate. The tolerable exception rate for each attribute requires the auditor's professional judgment. The tolerable exception rate can significantly affect the sample size. Figure 15-2 on page 494 of your textbook shows the tolerable exception rate on a sampling data sheet. The seventh step for Phase 1 is to specify acceptable risk of over-reliance. Sampling always has a risk of incorrect conclusions about the population used. The auditors are concerned with the risk of over-reliance because it impacts the effectiveness of the audit. The acceptable risk of over-reliance measures the risk the auditor is willing to take of concluding that a control is effective when the true population exception rate is greater than tolerable exception rate. Table 15-4 and Table 15-5 on the next slide provides an illustrative guideline for establishing acceptable risk of over-reliance and the tolerable exception rate for non-statistical sampling of tests of controls. You can find Table 15-4 and Table 15-5 on page 496 of your textbook. The 8th step of Phase 1 is to estimate the population exception rate. The auditor should make an estimate of the population exception rate to plan the appropriate sample size. If the estimated population exception rate is low, a relatively small sample will satisfy the auditor's tolerable exception rate. The 9th step of Phase 1 is to determine the initial sample size. 4 factors determine the initial sample size, which are the population size, the tolerable exception rate, the acceptable risk of over-reliance, and the estimated population exception rate. It is called an initial sample size because the exceptions in the initial sample must be evaluated before an auditor can decide if the sample is sufficient to achieve the objectives of the test. Table 15-6 shows the effect on sample size of independently increasing each factor. The opposite effect will occur for decreasing each factor. For example, if there is an increase in tolerable exception rate, there will be a decreased effect on initial sample size. Likewise, an increase in estimated population exception rate will have an increased effect on initial sample size. You can find tables 15-6 on page 497 of your textbook. For Phase 2, the steps involved are selecting the sample and performing the audit procedures. In selecting the sample, in this step, auditors can choose any of the methods presented to select the initial sample to use in the audit. In contrast, when performing the audit procedures, the auditor performs the audit by examining each item in the sample to determine whether it is consistent with the definition of the attribute and by maintaining a record of all the exceptions found. You can find an inspection of sample items for attributes worksheet in Figure 15-3 on page 498 of your textbook. Phase 3 of the non-statistical sampling involves evaluating the results of the sampling by generalizing from the sample to the population and analyzing the exceptions. The sample exception rate can be calculated from the actual sample results by dividing the actual exceptions by the actual sample size. When the sample exception rate exceeds the estimated population exception rate used in designing the sample, the auditor can conclude that the sample results do not support the preliminary assessed risk. The sample exception rate and calculated allowance for sampling risk is summarized in Figure 15-4 on page 500 of your textbook. The exception analysis is also illustrated in Figure 15-5 on page 501 of your textbook. Another step in Phase 3 is deciding the acceptability of the population used in the audit. If the sample exception rate is less than the expected rate, the auditor will conclude that the sample does not indicate any significant problems. However, when the sample exception rate does exceed the estimated population exception rate, the auditor will then conclude that the results are unacceptable and must follow one of 4 courses of action. The auditor will revise tolerable exception rate or acceptable risk of over-reliance, expand the sample size, revise the assessed control risk, or to communicate with the audit committee or management of the result of the audit. It is important to note that the auditor needs to retain adequate documentation of the procedures performed, the methods used to select the sample and performance of the audit test, the results found in the testing, and the conclusions reached by the auditor. The conclusions of the test of controls and substantive test of transactions will determine the remainder of the audit evidence that needs to be obtained. This evidence planning is illustrated in Figure 15-6 on page 504 of your textbook. In here, we have all of the steps involved in non-statistical sampling and is summarized in Figure 15-7. The 14 steps in this figure also apply to statistical sampling. You can find Figure 15-7 on page 505 of your textbook. Moving on, we will now discuss attribute sampling and a sampling distribution. The statistical sampling method most commonly used for test of controls and substantive test of transaction is attribute sampling. Statistical attribute sampling and non-statistical sampling use the same 14 steps as previously mentioned. The difference between the two are the calculation of the initial sample size are usually developed from statistical probability distributions, and the calculation of estimated upper exception rate uses statistical probability distribution. Auditors base their inferences on sampling distributions, which are a frequency distribution of the results of all possible samples of a specified size that could be obtained from a population containing some specific characteristics. Each population exception rate and sample size has a unique sampling distribution. Table 15-7 illustrates the sampling distribution for the example with a sample of 50 items from a very large population and an exception rate of 5%. To calculate the probability of obtaining a sample with at least one exception, the auditor will subtract the probability of no exceptions occurring from 1, which is 100%. By doing so, the likelihood of finding a sample with at least one exception is 1 minus 0.0769, or 92.31% of the population. You can find Table 15-7 on page 506 of your textbook. We will now discuss attribute sampling in test of controls and substantive test of transactions. The steps for attribute sampling are similar to those for non-statistical sampling, with a few exceptions. One exception is the specification of acceptable risk of over-reliance in attribute sampling. The concepts are the same, but the method of quantifying is usually different. Rather than using high, medium, and low, the auditor will use a specific amount in attribute sampling, such as 5%. The other exception is the determination of the initial sample size. The factors that affect the initial sample size are the same, but in attribute sampling, the auditor uses tables developed from statistical formulas or from an audit software to determine the initial sample size to use for the audit. This is illustrated in Table 15-8 on page 508 of your textbook. The only difference in sample selection is that probability sampling method must be used for statistical sampling. For attribute sampling, the auditor calculates the computed upper exception rate using a statistical formula. This is illustrated in Table 15-9 on page 509 and Figure 15-8 on page 511 of your textbook. One criticism of statistical sampling is that it reduces the auditor's use of professional judgment. However, the auditor does have to exercise considerable judgment in many statistical sampling decisions. We have reached the end of the discussions for Chapter 15. In this chapter, we have discussed the difference between statistical and non-statistical sampling, as well as the difference between probability and non-probability sample selection methods. Please complete the required evaluation method for Chapter 15 as it will be part of your final grade. Use Blackboard to complete the requirements. You have reached the end of the course presentation for Chapter 15. Please access the video for Chapter 16 for the next presentation of the course.